This girl calls a millionaire and says there's someone in his trunk, but moments later they discover something incredible. Rate my story from 0 to 10 in the comments. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The screams sliced through the muggy afternoon air like a blade, echoing through the brick streets of the historic downtown at precisely 3 p.m. The widowed, 52-year-old businessman nearly dropped his coffee mug as he stepped away from his penthouse window. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been coming from the brownstone across the street, a faded yellow two-story building with peeling blue shutters that starkly contrasted with the elegance of his modern condo. His investments yielded more in monthly dividends than many people earned in an entire year, but all that wealth couldn't silence that disturbing echo that invaded his routine. "Must be a kid throwing a tantrum," he muttered to himself, adjusting his tie before returning to work. As the owner of the largest construction firm in the region, he was accustomed to solving complex problems, but he preferred to keep his distance from other people's dramas. Especially after 5 years of living alone, ever since he lost his wife on a rainy night, he preferred not to remember. Across the street, inside the brownstone, the 4-year-old girl huddled in the corner of the kitchen, her small arms unable to comprehend why her aunt hated her so much. The 38-year-old woman firmly held a metal spoon that she had heated on the gas stove, her eyes red from the alcohol fixated on the child trembling before her. "You're a plague on this house," the aunt hissed, her voice slurred from the cheap whiskey she'd been drinking since noon at the local dive bar. "Because of you, my sister is gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the girl's small arm, leaving a red mark that would join the other scars that dotted her thin limbs. The child bit her lip to keep from screaming louder. She had learned that screaming only enraged her aunt further, who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absences caused by her addiction. The girl closed her eyes and tried to remember the soft voice of her mother singing that lullaby before bed. It was all that remained of her now, fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind during the most painful moments. "Stop whimpering," the aunt grunted, putting the spoon back in the drawer as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow. And if you get charcoal on the walls again, you'll see what real punishment is." The girl ran to the small room at the back of the house, a stifling space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up in the thin sheet and began to hum her mother's song softly, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that across the street someone had finally paid attention to that melody. The businessman stopped reviewing contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His wife used to sing it when she cooked, a folk song about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the brownstone. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that childlike voice, trembling but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something other than mere annoyance. There was something in that voice that struck a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. His stock portfolio grew automatically every day, but no profit could fill the void he had carried since his wife's passing. In the house next to the brownstone, a 61-year-old retired teacher was watering her begonias when she heard the girls singing. Unlike the businessman, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years teaching elementary school, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress, and that voice carried a pain that made her heart ache. "That's strange," she thought, observing the windows of the brownstone, a family she had known for decades. The aunt had always been troubled, but ever since she took custody of her orphaned niece, something had changed in the air of that house. The girl never played in the yard, never ran through the streets like the other children in downtown. The teacher dried her hands on her apron and made a decision. The next morning she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been a long time since she had spoken properly with the child's aunt, and perhaps it was time to get to know the little one better. Meanwhile, the businessman remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The music had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of his former employee who had resigned abruptly 5 years ago, a few months before the accident that took his wife. The employee was a kind woman, always humming while organizing the construction firm's files. Then suddenly she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought of her again until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to suffer in silence. The sun began to set over the mountains surrounding downtown when the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her small fingers clutched the sheet, and in her dreams, she flew like the bird she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the yard. Across the street, the businessman closed the curtains and tried to get back to work, but he couldn't concentrate. Something had changed that afternoon, something he didn't yet fully understand. For the first time in years, he felt that perhaps it was time to pay attention to what was happening beyond his own windows. Night fell over the historic downtown, but the echo of that children's song continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years fleeing his responsibilities, and of a retired teacher who had never been able to ignore the suffering of a child. The next morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical bustle of downtown awakening for another day. The retired teacher put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that wouldn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the brownstone. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. The aunt opened the door with a puffy face and red eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's drinking. "Good morning," the teacher said with her gentlest smile. "I've come to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've had a proper chat." The aunt hesitated, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "Oh, Mrs. Davis, it's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The teacher took a step forward, forcing the aunt to retreat. "And I'd love to meet your niece. I hear she's a lovely girl." The aunt's face hardened for an instant before forcing a weak smile. "The girl she's sick. High fever. Best not to get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher pricked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Perhaps I can help," the teacher insisted. "I have experience with sick children. Raised 3 myself, you know how it is." "No need, no," the aunt replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I've already taken her to the doctor. It's just the flu. It'll pass soon." The teacher noticed the aunt's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol that emanated from her even at such an early hour. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades of dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene from his window while having breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confusing dreams where the voice of a child mixed with memories of his former employee. When he saw the teacher at the door of the brownstone, a strange curiosity overcame him. The teacher finally said goodbye to the aunt, but not before casting an investigative look into the interior of the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided that she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the brownstone, the aunt locked the door forcefully and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl crouched behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height didn't allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in your room?" the aunt snarled, her irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty, aunt," the girl mumbled, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" The aunt laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the yard. And since you like to make so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The girl went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single apple tree. There, she sat on the ground and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the gas stove. It was always birds, small, large, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving the girl in the yard under the strong midday sun. The child began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So she began to sing her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was this melody that reached the businessman's ears again. This time he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar about that voice, that specific song. He picked up his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. As he recorded, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind. The employee hummed that same song while working. The employee, who had been an exemplary worker until disappearing abruptly. The employee, who always spoke fondly about her little daughter, a girl named... "This can't be a coincidence," the businessman muttered, his cell phone trembling in his hands. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The child suffering in the house across the street could be the daughter of his former employee, the kind woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How hadn't he made this connection before? The businessman put away his cell phone and began to pace back and forth in his apartment. His investments in cryptocurrency had yielded fortunes in recent years, but no amount of money could erase the guilt that was now growing in his chest. He vaguely remembered the employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems in the company, that he hadn't paid due attention. Now, 5 years later, the employee's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt that the businessman carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including regret for not having helped when he clearly should have helped. At 3 o'clock sharp, the screams started again. This time, the businessman didn't step away from the window. He watched with growing horror as, through the kitchen window of the brownstone, he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He picked up his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. The aunt was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and gesturing violently in the direction of a small figure that he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time the businessman couldn't pretend they were just childish tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. His capital, accumulated over decades of hard work, seemed insignificant in the face of the moral responsibility that now weighed on his shoulders. The question now was, what would he do with this information? That night, the girl slept on the ground in the backyard, where the aunt had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the apple tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish to her mother, wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her away from that place of pain. Across the street, the businessman couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife's passing. His investments continued to generate automatic profits, but for the first time in years, he questioned whether all that wealth had any real purpose if he couldn't protect an innocent child who was suffering right before his eyes. 3 days had passed since the businessman discovered the possible identity of the child, and the guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During these days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 o'clock, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that had haunted him since the night he lost his wife. On that Thursday morning, the retired teacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering just yards from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and they were all present in the brownstone. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting another direct visit to the aunt, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the place where she had the best view of the backyard of the brownstone. What she saw horrified her. The girl was sitting under the apple tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and underwear. Her small arms were marked by obvious burns, some still red and inflamed. The child was drawing on the ground with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. "My God," whispered Mrs. Davis, her hands trembling as she held the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined, much worse. The girl looked up and saw the lady watching her. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to the teacher's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. "Hi, Grandma," said the girl in her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly ladies. "Hi, sweetie," replied Mrs. Davis, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you okay?" The girl glanced quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "I'm fine. I'm just drawing birdies." "That's nice. Do you like birds?" "I like them a lot. They can fly wherever they want," replied the child, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke the teacher's heart. At that moment, the aunt's harsh voice echoed from inside the house. "Girl, where are you?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face told Mrs. Davis everything she needed to know. The girl got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran into the house, but not before looking once more at the teacher with an expression that screamed for help. Mrs. Davis remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to the aunt's voice. Everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend that she didn't know what was happening. Meanwhile, across the street, the businessman had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he could partially see the yard, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him sick. For the first time in 5 years, he felt genuine fury burning in his chest. His investment funds generated passive income that could support an entire family for decades, but all that fortune seemed useless in the face of the powerlessness he felt. The employee had trusted him in some way. Even if indirectly, even if he didn't know it at the time, she had left her daughter in the care of a family that lived in the same downtown where he lived. And now this child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable window, paralyzed by his own cowardice. At 11 in the morning, Mrs. Davis made a courageous decision. She put on her best business attire, took a tray of homemade cookies that she had prepared as a pretext, and went to the brownstone again. This time, she wouldn't take no for an answer. The aunt answered the door reluctantly, clearly annoyed by the neighbor's persistence. "Mrs. Davis, I already told you that it's not a good time." "Dear, I brought some cookies I made yesterday," interrupted Mrs. Davis firmly. "And I insist on getting to know the little one better. As old neighbors, it's our duty to support each other." Before the aunt could protest, Mrs. Davis had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom experience had given her. The interior of the brownstone was dark and smelled of mold mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the living room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," the aunt lied, blocking the way to the back of the house. "What a shame." "Maybe another time, then?" said Mrs. Davis, but her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that seemed to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the gas stove, and mainly small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. Mrs. Davis and the aunt froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "It must be the neighbor's cat," the aunt said quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. Mrs. Davis smiled and nodded, but had decided that she had already seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always right next door if you need anything. Anything at all." The tone of Mrs. Davis made it clear that it was not just a casual offer of help. It was a subtle but direct warning. After Mrs. Davis left, the aunt locked the door forcefully and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl huddled behind the gas stove, trying to hide. The child had cried upon hearing Mrs. Davis's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," accused the aunt, her eyes already shining with familiar fury. "No, aunt, I didn't make noise," protested the girl, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. The aunt picked up the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly in the flame. The girl recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want to get attention, don't you?" hissed the aunt as the spoon heated up. "You want the neighbors to come here and ask questions? You think I don't know how to take care of you?" Across the street, the businessman had positioned his cell phone at the window and was recording again. This time he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. His former employee had been a good person, a dedicated worker who always spoke of her daughter with love. That child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. While the girl suffered another episode of systematic torture, the businessman made a call that he hadn't made in months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend, Roberto. "Roberto, I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching through the window as the girl's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it may be a matter of life." On the other end of the line, the lawyer perceived the urgency in his friend's voice. "What's happening?" "I have evidence that a child is being mistreated in the house across from mine, and I believe she's the daughter of a former employee who worked with me 5 years ago. This is very serious. Are you sure of what you're saying?" The businessman looked at the cell phone in his hands, full of disturbing recordings. "I have proof, Roberto. Videos, audios. I need to know what to do legally. Come to my office tomorrow morning. Bring everything you have. If there really is a child being mistreated, we need to act quickly." That night, after the aunt fell asleep drunk on the living room couch, the girl managed to slip silently into the backyard. Her new burns were stinging, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the apple tree and looked at the stars, humming her mother's song softly. What she didn't know was that, for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering, and that, In the coming days, her life would change in ways she couldn't even imagine. Across the street, the businessman had finally found the courage to act. His financial assets continued to grow automatically, but for the first time in years, his money would have a greater purpose than just accumulating wealth. The lawyer arrived at the businessman's apartment on Friday morning with a grave look on his face. The two men had been colleagues at university almost 3 decades ago, and Roberto knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call the night before had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's happening," said Roberto, sitting in the spacious living room of the apartment. "You talked about a child in danger, but I need details." The businessman poured coffee and positioned himself near the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. "The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She's being mistreated by the aunt who takes care of her." "Mistreated how?" asked Roberto, taking a notepad out of his briefcase. "Burns, daily screams, neglect." The businessman paused, struggling with the words. "I have recordings, Roberto. Evidence of what's happening." Roberto was silent for a moment, processing the information. "This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact Child Protective Services immediately." "I know," replied the businessman, running his hands over his face. "But there's something more. The employee worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly in 2019, a few months before the accident with my wife. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible," completed Roberto, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The businessman nodded. "If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have needed to leave her daughter with this woman." At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and Roberto could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. "This happens every day?" he asked, horrified. "At 3 in the afternoon, religiously, but sometimes at other times too," replied the businessman, picking up his cell phone. "Want to see the recordings?" Roberto watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a lawyer specializing in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse. But something in the systematization of that violence disturbed him deeply. "We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings today. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services and the district attorney's office. That child needs to be removed from that house immediately." While the two men planned the intervention across the street, the girl was living another day of terror. The aunt had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol in the house. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the girl had made on the kitchen wall during the early morning hours. "How many times do I have to tell you not to get the walls dirty?" shouted the aunt, holding the girl by the arm hard enough to leave marks. "You're a plague, a curse on this house." The girl tried to explain herself, to say that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone, but the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. "You're going to be locked in your room until I decide what to do with you," continued the aunt, pushing the child down the hall. "And if I hear even a peep, you'll know a punishment you've never experienced before." The room where the girl was locked was small and stifling, with only a high window that she couldn't reach. There she curled up in the corner and began to sing her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort in a world that seemed to have forgotten that she existed. It was this song that the retired teacher heard as she passed by the brownstone on her way to the grocery store. The educator had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation with the girl in the yard, the marks she had seen on the child's arms, the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house. Mrs. Davis stopped in front of the gate and listened. The girl's voice was weak, but loaded with a sadness that made Mrs. Davis's heart break. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the grocery store, Mrs. Davis went directly to downtown, where the small office of Child Protective Services was located. She knew the caseworker Anna Beatriz well, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children. "Anna, I need to talk to you about a very serious situation," said Mrs. Davis, entering the office without ceremony. Anna Beatriz looked up from the papers she was analyzing. "Mrs. Davis, it's good to see you. What brings you here today?" "A child in danger, my neighbor. I'm sure she's being mistreated." Anna straightened up in her chair, her expression becoming immediately serious. During her 5 years as a caseworker, she had learned to recognize when a complaint was serious, and Mrs. Davis was not the type of person who would make frivolous accusations. "Tell me everything," said Anna, grabbing a complaint form. While Mrs. Davis was reporting her observations, across town, Roberto was in a similar meeting at the district attorney's office. District Attorney Lucas Andrade listened attentively as Roberto presented the evidence collected by the businessman. "This is compelling evidence," said the prosecutor, examining the videos on Roberto's cell phone. "I'm going to order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment." "How long will that take?" asked Roberto, worried. "With this evidence? We can act today," replied Lucas. "I'll contact Child Protective Services now. That's how, by a coincidence that would change the girl's fate, 2 simultaneous complaints reached Child Protective Services on the same morning." Anna Beatriz was finishing writing down Mrs. Davis's account when her phone rang. "Child Protective Services, Anna Beatriz speaking." "Anna, this is District Attorney Lucas Andrade. I need you to make an urgent intervention at a house on Brick Street. We have evidence of serious child abuse." Anna paused, the pen suspended over the paper. "Is that number 127 by any chance? Yellow brownstone?" "Exactly. How did you know?" "I just received a complaint about the same house," replied Anna, looking at Mrs. Davis with surprise. "2 independent sources. This confirms the seriousness of the situation." At 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being set up. Anna Beatriz, accompanied by 2 social workers and a court officer, was heading towards the brownstone. Mrs. Davis had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The businessman watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. Roberto was at his side, both witnessing the moment that would change the girl's life forever. "You did the right thing," said Roberto, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," replied the businessman, his eyes fixed on the team approaching the brownstone. In the house, the aunt had gone out to buy alcohol at the local dive bar, leaving the girl locked in the stifling room. The child continued singing softly, unaware that her life was about to change radically. When Anna Beatriz knocked on the door of the brownstone and received no answer, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside exceeded even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and obvious signs of neglect in every room. It was Mrs. Davis who first heard the faint voice coming from the room at the back. "There's someone here," she said, guiding the team down the hallway. When they opened the door to the room and found the girl huddled in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their heart. The child looked up with big, frightened eyes, not understanding who these people were or what they wanted from her. "Hi, sweetie," said Anna Beatriz, crouching down to be at the child's height. "My name is Anna. We've come to help you." The girl looked at Mrs. Davis, recognizing the kind lady who had spoken to her in the yard. A glimmer of hope shone in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by fear. "Aunt will be mad," she whispered. "You don't need to worry about that now," said Mrs. Davis, reaching out her hand to the child. We're going to get out of here, okay? And so, after 8 months of silent suffering, the girl was finally removed from the house, where she had known only pain and fear, beginning a journey that would lead her back to the light she had lost when her parents passed away. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene with tears in his eyes, knowing that his bitcoins and stocks would never give him greater satisfaction than that moment of redemption. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.